What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Super Smash Brothers and Platform Fighter tutorial series, we're going to be going over sudden death. Sudden death is what happens when there is a draw or a tie in a lot of platform fighters and a lot of games in general, so essentially first place or maybe even lower places like second or third place are tied. So multiple players have the same score at the end of the match. And to determine who is going to be the winner or claim that place, we're going to have an extra mode or an extra fight. So if we go into this here, we can go to battle, and I will pick my characters, but it doesn't really matter here. I've set my match to only be 5 seconds long, so we don't have to wait the whole time to show this off. Obviously, 5 seconds, I haven't defeated any opponents, so once the timer runs out, we call sudden death. Now, one major thing you see is that everyone's damage counter got set to 300%, so they're all going to be very weak and very able to be launched off of the map. The timer also stays. There's no timer anymore at this point. We're just going to wait for all opponents to be defeated. Now, my intention for today's episode is not actually handle all the sudden death logic. I just want us to be able to get into this state. So basically, recognize that players are tied at the end of a match to trigger sudden death, and then display a prompt on the screen and set the damage counters to 300%. That's all I want to do at the end of this episode. We're going to have the next episode all the logic for sudden death, such as taking away stock and checking for match end once a character is defeated in sudden death, because that's another thing we have to account for. Right now we are in our timed mode, so even if I were to defeat all these characters and all their stock, then it wouldn't actually end. It ends when the timer ends, but since we're in sudden death, we have to make sure we check for each character being defeated now, like in stock mode. So there are some differences, and we'll be covering them in the next episode on sudden death. So before we get started, if you want to get caught up in this series, I will link you to the entire playlist of the Platform Fighter and Super Smash Brothers series right here in the top right corner. You can check out how we've done things from items to damage counters and blast lines. Super fun stuff. Alternatively, if you don't care about that and you only care about sudden death, I will recommend that you watch this episode right here, which is where we actually finished our match. We determined the logic to end our match, whether it be time, stock, or things like that. We're going to need that logic today. That way, once the match finishes, we can check for sudden death. Now, with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We're going to do most of the behavior in the code in the C++ today, but we do have a few blueprint elements as well. So let's go to code, and specifically let's go to the SSB template character game mode.h. We want to have a function in here that we can call when we determine that sudden death should be activated. Basically, when a tie has been found, we're going to call a function to trigger the sudden death portion of the match. So I'm going to scroll down to where my functions are, and I'm going to create one called void display sudden death info. As the comment says here, it's to update the HUD with sudden death information such as the time and sudden death text. You could definitely do other things like have a visual effect around the stage, change the way the characters look, give them like a red glow in their eyes. I've seen games do cool effects like that in sudden death modes. So you do have a lot of options, and this function is going to be for all the blueprint behavior for all of those. So I've made it a U function that is blueprint implementable event. This means that we can call this function in the code, but we're going to fill out all the behavior for it in the blueprint. Once you have this function, we can go into the SSB template game mode.cpp, and we can scroll down to our determine winner function. So in determine winner, we were doing this logic right here. We were looping through the player scores just to determine who had the highest score, and that was literally it. As we looped, if we found one with a higher score than the current highest, we set the winner index to the index that we were currently looping through. So essentially, if player 1 had a higher score than player 0, player 1 is the new winner at the current time. However, now we also want to check to see if the scores are equal. That's what a tie is, or a draw. The scores have to be the same. So I've added a new boolean in here. Bool is tied, and basically is first place currently tied. We're not actually checking to see if every position is tied right now. Certainly something we could do and may do in the future, but for now, and to trigger sudden death, we're only going to do it if first place is tied. So essentially, I'm going to have first place always be first place. There's only one of them. Second place, you could have two of them, really. So say player 2 and 3 had the same score. They'll both be in second. Then say player 4 had a lower score than both of them. He would go to fourth. instead of third. You really do have full freedom over it, so it doesn't really matter. I'm just letting you know that's how I'm setting it up for the time being. So this is tied boolean is just checking to see if first place is currently tied. Now, in the logic from before, where we were checking to see if there was a new highest score and setting the winner index to that, if we find a new winner, we are going to invalidate is tied, set it to be false. This is because we want to set is tied to be true if the highest score is found at another point. So if we're updating to a new highest score, then that means no score before that had the same value. So we weren't tied as far as first place goes. Draws/ties for positions other than first don't trigger sudden death. So is tied equals false. But I've also added an else if statement today. So else if highest score is equal to player scores I. Before we were checking if highest score was less than player scores I. Now we're checking if they're equal. If they're equal, that's a sign of a tie or a draw. So we're going to set is tied to be true. After this for loop, we had determined the winner index, and so we were going on to set each character as in their victory or defeat state based on that. We were also stopping the characters from moving and displaying a menu to indicate that the match was over. All of this behavior is still behavior that we want to do, but I've encompassed it within this if statement. If not is tied. So we only want to do this behavior if we did not find a tie, because if we found the tie, we're going to go to sudden death. So we don't want to do anything in here. We don't want to set the defeat or victory states. We don't want to set can move to be false. And we don't want to display the menu saying the match is over, because it's not over. So only do this if we're not tied. And then else, if we are tied, we want to call a function enter sudden death. Enter sudden death is another one we're going to make in today's episode. So let's go to SSB template gamemode.h again and scroll down. We had display sudden death info, and then the other one we have is enter sudden death. And as the comment says, enter the sudden death state of the match. Basically, we're just going to trigger sudden death. This is going to encompass all the behavior of it, right? So the one I mentioned earlier to you, the display sudden death info, is for the HUD, for the UI, for any effects. But enter sudden death is going to be setting the state, the match state, changing the character's health, things like that. Void enter sudden death. We can go create this function. So go to SSB template gamemode.cpp and scroll down. And I put it right below my determine winner. Void ASSB template gamemode, : enter sudden death. In here, I want to set every character to have the proper sudden death value. So that could be changing their position, changing their damage counter, changing their stock, and other things as well. So I'm going to loop through each player for integer I equals 0, I is less than players.num, ++ I. So basically loop through every player in our players array. Essentially the same loop we did up above when we were setting the character states and the ability to move, so nothing that we haven't seen before. Now for each player or each character, I want to call a function. So I made a function in my SSB template character.h. Let's go ahead and make that now. So I'm scrolling down to my functions. I'm going to make sure this one is public because I am calling it from the game mode. So I'm looking for my public section here, right here. And I've made a new function, void prepare for sudden death. Like the comment says, we're updating the character's information to the default sudden death values. And those are the things I mentioned before, the stock, the damage counter, their positions, whatever else. So let's go ahead and make this function. I'm going to go to SSB template character.cpp and I put it here, but it doesn't matter where you put it, just decide where you want to put it in your code. Void ASSB template character, : prepare for sudden death. And the first thing I did was set the damage counter to be 300. We could do other things like set lives to 0. Now the reason I'm not actually doing the lives in here right now is because we really need to check for what type of match it is. If it's a time match, we don't really need to set lives to be 0. We just want to stop them from being able to respawn. Now, if it's stock, you would want to set their lives to be 0, but again, that's all covered in the next episode. So for right now, I'm just making sure we can see it, make sure that our functions are being called correctly. So I'm setting my damage counter to be 300. Now, once I create this function, we can go back to the SSB template gamemode.cpp and call it. So players at index I is going to call that new function, prepare for sudden death. So this is what's setting each character's damage counter to be the starting sudden death value. This is going to change as it becomes more complicated, but that's all it's doing for right now. Now, once we've set all of our values properly, we want to go ahead and update our HUD and our UI with all those effects that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to call our display sudden death info blueprint implementable event that we set up at the start of this episode. And now we are good to go in the code, so I'm going to relaunch the editor and catch up with you. Alright, the editor is back open, so the first thing we're going to do is go to our base game mode BP, because that is where we can fill out the event for the logic that we created. And in here, if you've been following the series, you'll have a lot of stuff, but we don't need to edit any of that today. We just need to grab our new event, our display sudden death info that we made in the code class, and we called in enter sudden death. So we can search for it by name, display sudden death info. You'll get this node right here. Now in here, all we want to do for today's episode is trigger the sudden death text to appear on the screen and then hide it after a couple seconds have passed. Now I already have a HUD reference in my game mode BP, but if you're curious what that looks like, in my begin play for the game mode, I create my character HUD widget and then set the reference to it immediately after. So this is quite literally just a reference to my HUD widget, which we need to go into anyway. So for me that is called character HUD. In here, I've added one thing today, and that is this sudden death text widget. Before, in the series, it looked like this. I've added this text box right here that says sudden death. And to do that, I added a text widget to my canvas panel here. I called it sudden death text. I made it a variable because we are going to change its visibility. I gave it an anchor of the middle here. Set my positions for exactly where I wanted it. Change my alignment to 0.5 and 0.5 just so that it fits directly in the center of the screen, because if I leave them at 0, then the top left is the origin. That's what gets anchored to the center. I want the entire text box to be in the center, and then have this position Y offset of -75. So that's why I set it up this way. You don't necessarily need to click size the content. You could, like I did. I find it easier because I like to write out my text and position it first, finalizing everything about it, but you could easily just turn off size the content or leave it turned off and just change this position more, like make it -350 for example. That's up to you. Again, this is just my setup for it. I'm showing it to you. For the actual text, I just hard-coded sudden death here because I don't ever expect this to change. But of course you could make a variable if you wanted this to be able to change to different words or sayings. Now for my appearance of the text, I have just solid white. I changed my font size to 216 with an outline size of 8. Obviously put in here whatever you want. For the justification, I made it the center. If you leave it as the left, then it's going to look like this. I thought the center just looked a little bit better, but it is your pick. And I set the visibility to be hidden by default because I don't want this showing up when the HUD is created. It's not sudden death until very late in the match, if at all. So it should start as hidden. And there you go. Now, if you don't want this to be showing up on your character HUD when you're editing the widget, you can click the little eyeball to hide it here. For me, I don't mind. I can work around it, so I'm going to leave it visible, but that is an option that you have. Now, we need to go into the graph of the HUD, and this is where we are going to update the visibility of this text. So first things first, we need to create an event that we can call from the game mode. That's why we set up these two nodes right here. So I'm going to make a new event by right-clicking, add custom event, and I called it display sudden death text. In this event, I grab my sudden death text variable. This is the actual text from the design view. That's why we made it a variable. And I drag off of it and type set visibility, and I set it to be visible. When this event gets called, we are entering sudden death, so we do want to display the sudden death text. After that, I call a function setTimerByEvent. So setTimerByEvent will call another event once a certain amount of time has passed. So I use my event section here, drag off that, add a custom event, and I call this one hide sudden death text. So once this timer ends, it will call this event. That's what we have here. For now, I've set the time just to be 3 seconds. Again, you could hard code it like I have here, or you could make it configurable. That way you can change that number. So after 3 seconds, this timer will finish. We'll call this event, and this event is going to hide the sudden death text. So I'm going to grab my sudden death text variable again, drag off of it, set visibility, and I'm going to set it back to hidden this time. Now that is this entire event and everything we need to update in the character HUD. Now let's go back to the base game mode BP, drag off of our HUD reference, and call our new function, display sudden death text. We'll get this node right here, and now it will work perfectly. We play, we will get the result that you expect. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope it helped you make sudden death in your game. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself in the series than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. If you want to get merch or extra rewards for supporting the channel, you can go ahead and support me using Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord subscriptions. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out, and that support is completely free. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.